Hello. Okay, this is the third and last part of virtue ethics, and today we're just going to be looking at a few questions that some contemporary analysts have had about virtue ethics, and then I want to explain how you would use this theory to apply to a case. So one question about virtue ethics has to do with when we really want to say a person has a character trait or a virtue like courage. And this is often illustrated by a pretty well-known example in philosophy of two firefighters. So like we see in this picture, you have two firefighters who both need to run into a burning building to save somebody. One of them is very, very afraid and has to kind of force himself to do that, whereas the other one just goes in without having to stop and consider or force himself. So they're performing the same act, and the question is, which one of those two firefighters really has developed the virtue of courage? So usually, when we're not thinking about Aristotle and we're not thinking about virtue ethics, we're inclined to give more praise to the firefighter who was afraid and did it anyway. For Aristotle, that person is definitely working toward cultivating the virtue of courage, but that person does not actually have that character trait. How do we know that? Because he had to force himself, because he had to think about it. And the one who was able to go in without stopping to think about it and without forcing himself, we would say has a character trait manifested in habitual action that's good for a person to have. He's internalized it. He doesn't have to force himself to do it anymore. So this can seem counterintuitive if we want to give praise to people for working to overcome their tendency towards certain vices. We should be giving more praise or more credibility to people who have already embodied those virtues, according to Aristotelian theory. Another common example that comes up a lot is whether you can use virtues to do bad things. And the example that's often given is the example of a courageous criminal, someone who uses virtues like courage or craftiness or wit even to perform a bad act. So are there any like super crazy bank heists, for example, that require a lot of intelligence and planning and courage, yet those are all virtues, and yet they're doing it for a bad end? Most contemporary virtue theorists would say no, because if you really had a good virtuous character, it would not lead you to perform bad acts. And if you're going to perform a bad act like robbing a bank, then you probably embody many vices, like greed, for example, that would allow us to say that you do not, in fact, have a virtuous character. The other thing that we need to talk about is the role of moral exemplars. Moral exemplars are basically role models, and they're examples that we can use to guide our own behavior when we have not yet become virtuous ourselves, and we're trying to figure out how to do that. So one thing that we talked about last time was that we all have to kind of force ourselves to behave as if we were virtuous until we embody those character traits ourselves. One way to do that is to use reason to figure out what a virtuous person would do in a given circumstance and then do that thing. Another thing to do is, if we really feel at a loss, is to look to a role model or a moral exemplar, someone that we want to be like, in order to cultivate those same virtues. So this could be anybody. It could be someone you know, a parent or a teacher. It could be a famous person. It could be a fictional character like Wonder Woman. But the idea here is that this is a good starting point, and this is something that would allow us to sort of start off on the right path toward cultivating that virtue. There are some dangers there, because if we look to role models, that means that we're not really tailoring it to our own specific situation as much. And we need to keep in mind that when we try to cultivate virtue, we're trying to find this golden mean between two extremes that's specific to who we are and what we're doing in life. So there are some limitations to using these role models. So if you wanted to analyze a case using virtue ethics, there are certain steps that you would want to go through. Even though I'm not asking you to use virtue on your essay that you're writing for me, this is something that you might have to do on the exam. So keep in mind how you would go about doing this. First, you got to figure out who it is, who the moral agent is in the situation. So if we want to return again to the example of the Tom and Carol case, Tom's the one who's got to make the decision about what to tell his wife. And then you want to think about what character traits you think that person ought to possess in the situation, in the moral dilemma that we're talking about. So Aristotle gave us some examples of virtues. We can choose our own. So you're not limited to Aristotle's list of examples. However, whatever you choose, you ought to be able to show how that character trait represents a good golden mean midpoint between too much and not enough. So you would have to relate these virtues to that moral agent's own situation. Why are these the character traits that we think this person ought to have here in this situation? And explain how that character trait occupies this midpoint between too much and not enough. So a virtue that a lot of us might want Tom to have is honesty, for example. We would have to talk a little bit about why that virtue is relevant to Tom's particular situation and how he could arrive at the golden mean of the exact right amount of honesty without going to the excess of excessive truthfulness, oversharing, or the deficiency of withholding information. And then you would want to talk about, okay, well, if this person had this character trait, what would he or she do? And even if the person isn't already virtuous, even if the person doesn't already have that character trait, what you would do is recommend that he or she still act that way in order to cultivate the habit of virtue. So those are the ways in which you would use virtue ethics to analyze a case. So virtue ethics is a little different. It's not quite the same type of decision-making tool that we saw before, where you're in a moral dilemma and you figure out what to do by applying utilitarianism or deontology. In this case, because we're concerned about your character and what type of person you are, what you have to think about is, if I was a virtuous person, if I was a good person, if I had these qualities that I know I ought to have, how would I act? And then force yourself to act that way until it becomes a habit. That's all I've got for virtue, and I'll see you guys next time.